Okay, everyone ready? Good. Okay, three, two, one. Wait. Whatever. Okay, three, two, one. Now, first on framing, what does MSP look like? Two pieces under this. The first thing is that it probably takes a shit ton of work by the government. I want to be very clear that MSP forces the government to be a middle ground in every single instance of farming subsidies. The reason this is important is because it means they have to set up infrastructure to make this happen. It likely takes up a huge amount of their Department of Agriculture budget because they don't just have to set up direct buying and selling channels with the farmers themselves. Because they're now all the production centers, they thus need to sell to all the consumers themselves too. The reason this is likely really difficult is because the reason this is likely very like a significant burden on the government is because they have to create channels in every single part of India, and there's no possibility for private fill-in, which means every single step of the process has to be done by them with infrastructure built by them. And note that this is extremely unique to India itself, because India is a super developing country where there are tons of different places in India that are like double the population that they were 5 years ago, for instance. This is the government is always on the back end and always on the back burner because they have to keep shifting around where the distribution centers must be because the needs of each population are constantly changing to how fast and quickly developing India actually is. What second piece of framing? What do the prices actually look like? I just think the minimum support price is actually likely quite low. Several reasons. First is just based on the ones that I gave before, which the government has to do a lot of their money doing this. They probably don't have as much money to give the farmers themselves. Two, the farmers, because there's like not a clear differentiation, you can't really base the quality off the products. The farmers are probably just basing it off of like the most widely mass produced product, not ones that are like not like if the average price based on like the quality of good would be higher towards the median, because the government is just assuming that people are mass producing, they're always going to skew low. The reason this is bad is because it just means farmers get less money, and government and like this like incentivizes farmers way less. Given that first full constructive substantive argument, is just why is MSP bad? Subpoint A is speculative bubbles. India's agriculture sector is growing right now dramatically because 10 years ago, it just wasn't really getting that much investment. But right now, due to all the new AI green agriculture tech startups that are happening in India, there's a ton more private investment going into the sector now that wasn't recently before. The problem with this is that this creates a supply demand mismatch where it's not extremely clear how this private investment is going to result in demand is going to result in is going to result in like the surplus it creates or like the amount of economic benefit you create. The problem with this is that this doesn't dissuade investors because all the investors are just like, AI tech, cool. India has a huge market. And so that's why they're flocking to India regardless. However, though, it's because it's unclear what the exact results of the investment are going to be. You are way less likely to get efficient investment because you have no idea what the price of these investments actually should be. You don't have the idea how to actually value these companies because the prices of the MSP are so unstable, because they're constantly changing for all the framing arguments. This creates speculative bubbles where the prices of these things are just super, super unclear. So inevitably, when these large farmer companies or these large green like agri-tech companies are leaving out or like putting out their earnings reports and they just don't match up with what's going on, these bubbles burst. And that's really, really bad for tons of reasons. First, they already use this investment, but the investors no longer want to invest anymore, which means while they're waiting for an extra line of credit to continue paying all the staff that they just hired with all this money, those people have to get laid off. Two, it likely means that this creates ripple effects on every single other part of the industry because it creates a chilling effect with investors in every single other agriculture business because it's always the worry that they're not going to return as they once were before. And three, the likelihood that these bubbles actually crash is quite high because of all the speculation arguments that I gave above, because of all the inconsistency arguments I gave in the framing, but also just because the Indian agriculture industry is in a huge changing. It's changing a lot right now. The reason for this is quite simple. It's because of all the agri-tech startups are not the same companies that are dominating and monopolizing the main agriculture, like the big farms and stuff like this, because they're often coming from like the city centers and stuff like that, not the agriculture centers, because that's where all the tech is. That's where the smart people that are making all this stuff is, which likely means the sector is quite disruptive, which means the bubbles are likely to burst, which just has ripple effects down to everything that I talked about before. Subpoint B is just the supply and demand mismatch. This is just the most intuitively bad argument for this, which is that because producers are not creating crops based on what consumers need, you are super likely to get over demand because you just have no because it's just super unclear how it's super unclear what people want to buy and stuff like this. The problem with this is that this just makes big farms overproduce like crazy, but also inefficient amounts in whatever they have the comparative advantage in. Because if they know the government is going to buy what the info slide is, quote, an unlimited amount of their product, then obviously I'm just going to go with whatever is cheapest for me to make, which is the whatever I'm mass producing at economies of scale for however much I can produce of it, which leads to inefficient land usage because I'm just inefficient crop like crop selection, because maybe if I was selling to the open market, I would be like, hey, I need 5 grains of rice, but people don't want to buy more than 5 bags of rice. So after the 5th bag of rice, I'm going to start making cucumbers instead, but that doesn't exist anymore. Then I just make 25 bags of rice because the government's going to buy it no matter what. The problem is it creates overproduction because now there's overproduction of specific types of products, but B, it also makes it such that the way you farm these products is super bad because you're not like because there's like no because like you're not trying to make the best products and stuff like this. The other impact of this is agriculture independence. Because they're overproducing all stuff like this, it means India has to import a lot of crops that they're not making at mass scale right now. Whereas before, maybe the Indian diet is not super focused on cucumbers, but there needs to be some amount of cucumbers. But now they need to import all their cucumbers because nobody is making them because there's no incentive to do so. The problem is this creates lots of dependence on other countries, creates less stability, and makes the Indian price market overall for agriculture really unstable. But this also trades off with other imports. Actually, I'll get to that later, or maybe in the truth in the MG. Some points use the quality of crops. There's no reason to differentiate, and you're likely to have bad practices and most corner cutting. The impact of this is the Indian diet because it just means that you never get good crops because no matter how you produce it, the minimum price is likely to be the same, and the government's probably not differentiating that much between this. And even if they do, it likely means the way the minimum it trades off with how good the minimum price can be because they have to spend research figuring out what is good and what is bad. Some point D is it's bad for the Indian Department of Agriculture. The reason for this is this trades off with other things they could do for all the framing arguments as to why this is likely very expensive. It likely means they can't do other things like invest in irrigation, invest in other supporting infrastructure, give subsidies to smaller farms like that. Okay. I don't have much time. Next, what does price deficiency actually look like? Note that its target price is plural, which means its target price is plural, which means it operates differently in different markets and the government also has less things to do and less places to be. So subpoint A as to why MSP is actually good is the open market is actually just fair. Under MSP, only a small percent of large landowners and farmers are from Punjab that benefit the most. But in most open markets with price deficiency mechanisms, all farmers can sell to the market, even if the market writ large isn't doing well. Open market is good for local nuances as such. Subpoint B is that even if the open market isn't creating producer surplus, it creates more consumer surplus, which probably matters more because obviously the consumers are less well off and most of the producers are large farms. Subpoint C is the government trade-offs argument. This is just the flip side of the comparative that I gave in the first independent argument, which is that when the government has more money because they're not spending nearly as much because they're not subsidizing literally everything, they're not doing all the infrastructure things that I said before, they can spend more money doing other things, making crops more efficient and stuff like that, creating like more surpluses for people that are poor. And subpoint D is newer industries and newer jobs. The private sector dealing with all this is probably a good thing because the Indian government is really bad and inefficient for all the framing arguments at the beginning, but it also creates tons of opportunity because there's no incentive to meet these other new demand areas because the Indian government is so corrupt and stuff like this. Proud to propose.
Right. Off case, on case. First, in framing, we think that farmers are likely poor for a couple reasons. The first is about 85% of smaller farms in India are small landholdings, so it's not these massive like groups like Pramod talks about. It's likely like small family farms. They often have low bargaining power because there's perfect competition for goods, i.e., every farmer is making grain. They also have high fixed costs. They have to pay land rent. They have to buy seeds. They have to buy tools, and they're highly dependent on initial amounts of credit to buy all of the inputs, and then they have to wait forever for crops to grow until they can sell. And because there are often high degrees of uncertainty in farming, aka a drought or like some weevil getting in and destroying all your food can destroy all your food at any moment. The second piece of framing is that we think that the government purpose is to be a safety net for farmers, i.e., both of these policies is the purpose to actually help farmers. So we should evaluate the types of policies based on their ability to help farmers the most. With that, quickly on the model, why we think that MSP is super hard to enforce, and I think Pranav literally gives you the warrant at the end of the PMC. He says that the government is very inefficient and likely high levels of corrupt. That's really bad because farmers often need receipts showing the market price at what they sold, which creates space for corruption and fraud. So when you have middlemen like lawyers or accountants, they can often manipulate manipulate paperwork to pocket subsidies, or even just individual officers who are processing all the receipts can just be like, oh, I don't really give a fuck and I'm not going to give you this, so I want to pocket themselves. We also think that bureaucracy is just very inefficient, which means that these delays on reimbursements can mean months of not having cash. And farmers need profit at harvest, not months later, because they don't have these savings to rest on. And they also need to buy new inputs to have like the next round of crops. We also think that farmers might not understand how to apply for subsidies in the first place or fill out paperwork wrong and get rejected. And local government officials have incentives to not necessarily help them or tell them correctly, or only like actually like process the subsidies after they get harassment bribes in order to give money back to the farmers. We think that the visibility of procurement on our side of the house, like when you can physically see warehouse and like unions can monitor qualities and politicians are held accountable. So the failures are obvious on our side and obvious and politically explosive. And the question of enforcement is binary because it's just like the government buys your crop at NFC. On their side, if the government delays or underpays, it often looks like a paperwork glitch because enforcement is much more vague. Did the government calculate deficiency correctly? Was it paid on time? Where records were cut? The impact is that this hurts farmers because they don't have any money. Harvest season is a cash crunch because farmers in India borrow heavily before planting because they need stuff like all of their inputs like fertilizers and tool rentals and basic necessities. So harvest season is a time where they need to get a lump sum in order to pay off those debts. Under PDP, they must sell to traders first, often at rock bottom prices set by predatory middlemen or cartels. The government promises to top this up later, but these payments are delayed for weeks or months. It's like working for your employer for weeks and then telling you that they will pay you in a month when the payment clears, but your rent is due tomorrow. Without immediate payment, these money lenders demand their cut right after harvest. And what's the weighing argument here? We think that MSP small farmers who can't negotiate with traders or store grain waiting for high prices. They have to sell immediately or else their crop gets wasted and they get less compensation. PDP favors large farmers who can wait it out on the market, navigate bureaucracy, access credit to cover delays, which means that equality only worsens on their side of the house. Notably, also on our side of the house, small farmers have to take out loans at exploitative interest rates, often 20 or 30%, and continue borrowing more money because interest snowballs faster than income. So even if the government pays them back, that money now has to go to cover debt payments, so small farmers still end up worse than before, and because they often don't have collateral, their horses might get foreclosed on and their assets are seized, which leads to debt, dividend destroyer, and complete loss of livelihood, i.e. when your farm is over, what does that mean? It means that you have to go over to the city to start an entirely new industry, and people often lose their entire way of living and have to move and end up in much worse situations than before, which is why we've probably seen the massive growth of slums in India, for example, because people are all moving to the cities. Our second offensive argument is that the government being able to have food is good. On our side of the house, the government can buy all of the grain and then distribute it, which feeds millions of households, but there's no government-owned grain on their side of the house. We think that this is bad for poor people because on our side of the house, you have government distribution networks, especially for people in cities. This is especially bad for people in the cities with no farmers because urban people are not able to necessarily go over to the market and buy it right at cost from the farmer at quote-unquote market price. The people from cities are buying the secondary cost after traders brought it into the city. So now these private traders are the only ones who have the possibility to bring food into the city. On our side of the house, the government buys it for cost and then sells it to consumers at cost. And so both small farmers and city people are helped. But on their side of the house, the only people who actually are helped are these traders who buy it in for low cost on the farmers because they promise that the government is going to pay it back, and they bring it into the cities and now they have the monopoly on goods. And we think that private incentives are always going to trend to making it really, really high cost because they have the monopoly on food, as opposed to the government, which has political incentives to keep food prices lower for cities. On to the on case. The first thing that I want to clear about is on the model. They say that, this is a shit ton of work by the government, and so there's no infrastructure to make this happen. But notably, the infrastructure is already done because their side of the house is a model. The MSP model has been around since the 60s, which means that the infrastructure has already been developed. And even if it is the case that, the Indian cities are rapidly growing, so you have to ship new market centers, I don't think that farms are necessarily up and moving. The government still has current distribution networks and current grain centers, and even if they change it around slightly or increase how much they buy from one area versus another, they don't have to build entirely new buildings. This has already been done. Only on our side of the house do we have to entirely replace everything of how we do. You have to set up this entire new way of how we're going to do subsidies. You have to hire officers to do this. You have to figure out, how to explain to farmers and set up this whole new bureaucracy only on our side of the house. Second, they said that the minimum support price is low because the government has to spend this money on infrastructure and there's no clear differentiation, so they're just going to assume low. I think that the government has political incentives to keep and economic incentives of wanting to be able to have a growing economy, to have the prices be at a good median where farmers are still able to use that money and continue growing onto new food. But on our side of the house is actually where the prices for goods are likely going to be lower because traders only have profit incentives. So if you want to help the farmers, who is going to have better incentives? The government, which is held politically accountable, or traders, which are only held accountable to their wallets? Then they said that MSP is bad because of speculative bubbles. One, I think this is untrue because A, there's not going to be bubbles if the government just sets a price. Investors aren't going to be surprised when the earnings report comes out from because they already know what the price is going to be. The government likely said it. I don't think that the price is going to be super unclear. The government probably every couple years is going to set a certain price for grain, and they're likely not going to reevaluate it constantly because they want people to have the knowledge of what my grain is going to cost when I'm putting in all of these inputs. So because the government has incentives to trend towards stability, they're likely not going to change it out that much, which means that investors aren't going to be surprised when the earnings report comes out because they already know exactly the cost in which the prices are going to be. On their side of the house, when traders have the ability to, like increase or decrease the price based on the market price is always going to be more volatile because it is more volatile because it's controlled by supply and demand. So they're more likely, like it's more likely to be like the speculative bubble. We think the more likely speculative bubble is when you have situations where traders collude to suppress prices and the government has to pay that gap. And because that incentivizes private buyers to depress prices further because the state is going to shoulder the risk. I also think that agriculture largely has inelastic demand. People always eat wheat and rice, whether or not investors are excited about it, and also because the vast majority of land holdings in India, 85% are small. I don't think that there's a massive amount of investment into these small farms. So even if there is investment, it's only in the like 20% of farms that are actually big enough to attract private investment. I also think that in startup culture, people overvalue because they lack information, but with agriculture, it's actually the opposite because people have too much market power and traders underpay. So MSP is far more likely to solve this because people actually have a reference point of what the price is going to be, which means that the surplus is not a bubble in the way like Nvidia is a bubble. Instead, it's a true stockpile for the public distribution. Then on supply mismatch, they say that they're going to overproduce to specific types of products. I think this is untrue for two reasons. The first is that the environment often affects what type of good that you can make, i.e. if the soil is not good for grain, I'm not going to be able to grow grain at all. I can only so regionally farmers can only probably do certain types of like agriculture based on what they're able to grow. I also think that because the vast majority of farms are like family farms that people have like learned over generations how to grow a specific type of crop, which means that they're more likely to grow the crop that they know how to do and not just randomly switch over to whatever like the government is going to pay for. I also don't think that India necessarily has to import crops that they don't make because Indian agriculture, like the types of goods that they produce have remained largely stable over time, which means that the like culture and the food that they make is always going to be about native crops. They're not going to all of a sudden switch over to an entirely new diet after like hundreds of years of eating the same types of food.
Ruth is going to join the Zoom from her laptop.
Okay, cool. Can you can people hear me? Okay, I'll take that as a yes, hopefully. Okay, it'll be two overviews and then it'll just be the off case and then the on case. Okay. Cool. First overview is that the market is monopolized. There's a few warrants. First is that there's high upfront costs from the LOC. Two is that small farms can't differentiate themselves per PMC quality arguments. Three is that farms are entrenched because you need to have tons of resources. Four is that subsidies and corruption prove that specific big farms CEOs get constantly bailed out and have tons of connections with politicians. Five is that cartel prices control to block out smaller farms. This top level takes out all of their arguments about how farms are incredibly unstable and need funds immediately and turns them. The second overview is on private investors. Why are private investors likely to invest in India's agricultural sector absent MSP? One is that rising incomes and the bigger like growing middle class means that there's more demand for diverse crops, which also means supply chain investment is super lucrative because India is super undercapitalized. Two is that warehousing, logistics, and storage or as well as like actual selling of crops is super good for market investment because right now there's huge inefficiencies and crops go to waste, which disincentivizes investors, but also means the government controls the supply chain because no company can invest. Three is that there's a political continuum because India is already opening sectors of things like insurance and retail, etc., which means that FDI and food processing makes agriculture like the natural next big step. And PDP signals to investors that random political unrest in India doesn't just reverse the trajectory, which is really important because if their farmer unrest arguments are true, it means that it's super volatile whether farmers support or oppose a policy, which means that the government can just piggyback, like switch back and forth, especially if they say that the government is held accountable by people, which means that disincentivizes investors. There's a few reasons as to why MSP bars investment. One is that private firms can't compete with fixed prices and unlimited crop selling. Two is that the like artificial prices scare investors away because they know it'll lead to speculation bubbles. And three is the farmer backlash argument. Why is FDI really good? First is that it solves the top of the LOC as to upfront input, upfront and input costs. But two, because it increases efficiency because you have lump sums amounts of money to do infrastructure, which also means that there's more money in the system overall and less burden on the Indian government, which also leads to like more jobs and things like that and investment in India, and also means that people like there's just like more investment in India, which is good. The off case first argument they make is that farmers are super poor and there's like not massive groups and there's like fixed costs. But first is that if there's high upfront costs, that means barriers to entry are high and the sector is already monopolized. The government already competes, which means the government already compensates the difference, which means that if there's a high degree of uncertainty, the government already accounts for that on either side and makes it non-unique. They say MSP is hard to enforce because the government is inefficient and it's a high level of corruption. This is a really silly argument. First is that there's in our world they're less dependent on the government, which means that if the corruption arguments are true, then it's probably a good thing to be less dependent. But second is that if bureaucracy is inefficient, then that's worse on their side because they have to wait a super long time to sell crops. If they say the government is squirrely, that's more of a reason as to why if you're solely dependent on the government, you have no other checkback mechanism against the government. This also goes both ways because it means the government can just create loopholes for buying at fixed costs, i.e. they can just delay like buying crops from farmers so much that which is so much worse because they don't have the market to check back against the government. They'll just wait until people don't want to sell anymore until the crops go bad because that just means they can delay using bureaucracy. The motion just says that the government buys at like an unlimited amount of crops, but it doesn't say when they buy the crops and things like that, which means once the crops go poor, they probably don't have to buy them. They say that they say that the like money lenders like demand like cuts right after the harvest, but you should turn this argument. This proves the way you should be able to sell in the market because market resiliency means you have more flexibility on when you sell these crops, which is probably a good thing for farmers who have to be able to like demand the cut right away. If the government is inefficient, then obviously the private sector will be able to solve this. They say that urban people can't go to the market can't go to the market at market price, and like small farmers have to take out loans and things like that. But first is that it's better if they just subsidize, but second is that the government can also still buy on our side, and third is that government has to recoup the losses for inefficiency, so they mark up even more than the private sector because like there's no warrant for why like the government wouldn't have to do this, especially since they have to like relocate, right? Like if they buy predominantly from like Punjab, which we say is where most of the actual farming actually happens, and they have to relocate and supply to elsewhere, they obviously have to recoup the cost. But compare that to local farmers who already are selling in their local regions, they don't have to account for that price differential, which means that you're much more likely to see them which means you're much less likely to see markup. But second is the competition argument because when you have local farmers that are competing in their local economies, you see much more competition that is tailored to the contextual market and not just nationally in India, i.e. like there's different purchasing powers in different states of India, which means that the government sets a national standard which says doesn't change over throughout the years. It means that different parts of India don't have the ability to be resilient and adapt to the changes in prices, but local markets are much better for making food more affordable for like everyday people. On case first argument they make is that the infrastructure is already done because the MSP model has been there since the 60s. They have not proven that the model has been done well. This just means that the infrastructure might exist, not that the infrastructure is good. But second is that there's already been so much like farmer unrest and supply chain shocks, which means that even if the infrastructure exists, the supply chains and things like that are still like they have to be rebuilt up, and it's probably better for the private sector to do it. They say that you have to like set up a new way and hire officers in our world, but that's not true. The free market already exists. You don't need to set up agriculture from scratch. This is ridiculous. But second, if anything, it's growing right now with the growing middle class, which means that the Overton window to be able to actually like create this change is better because it takes more resources to actually curb the existing market than it does to just let the market grow naturally. They say the price won't be low because the government won't set the price and won't reevaluate, but this means that they won't account for inflation either, which means either the government's price is going to be super low and farmers don't make a profit, or it means that the price changes all the time, which leads to artificial volatility, which turns all of their volatility arguments. They say the government has better incentives because they're politically accountable, but yes, they're only accountable to the the richest landowners in Punjab, so that's where they will sell. There is no warrant as to why small-scale farmers have any political influence on India's government as to why, how they're going to sell and things like that. But if anything, this is worse because it means that these, like the government is only held accountable to places that actually lead to donations and where the money actually is, which means that they're much more likely to only buy from like and they're much more likely to like only cater to like large landowners that then like that the smaller farmers buy land from, which means that they're now small farmers have to now be accountable to the government, but also need to be accountable to the landowners who are super exploitive, which turns all their exploitation arguments. They say agriculture has inelastic demand and people eat rice regularly. This proves why the market checks back and there's no volatility. This like is just defense on their arguments, but all that means that all you get on their side is a lack of diversity in crops. They say that there's a public mismatch because it's untrue like which like because of like the environments in which you can grow crops, but no, you can grow a set of crops in different parts of India. It's just a question of which crops they pick, i.e. if I can grow rice and cucumbers, I'm always going to choose rice because it's the most stable crop. I'm never going to diversify. But second is that there's not that much like the topography in India is not that different, which means that there's not that much variation. So you can probably grow a lot of crops. They say that you switch over to family farms and things like that, but no, they have conceded the top of the PMC that tells you that there's the Overton window for why like small farms would change over is because now they have more of a profit incentive to switch over from what their family's techniques are, especially because now there's more growing demand for diversity of crops, which means this growing demand is exactly why farmers would switch over. They say but also that's also why there's so much of the surplus in rice surplus in India, but not good quality or variety crops. Um, okay. People on the ground matter definitely a lot more than farmers. Their only argument for farmers first is that they're poor and they need money for their next season. But if they're correct that most of the input are fixed costs and not variable costs, then this doesn't matter anyway. And if you buy our overview that the market is monopolized and they're already super well off, which means that comparatively tons of people are obviously poor and need government assistance because they aren't being helped per the population arguments in the PMC and because of corruption. But also the market overall is bigger and stable on our side because it leads to like investment in FDI and less volatility from bubbles, which means that the disruption in markets are way better when the private sector can fill in. Um, but also the government is just like way better at helping people on our side. I think there's like a few reasons for this. First is that the government probably is able to redirect resources in a way that's really good because now they don't have to spend all this money on like wasting and inefficiencies, but also they have there's like more subsidization, which means that the subsidies can then help like specific targeted areas of the economy or like the agricultural sector that are like super bad. So instead of just like having like an overall price and having to focus on everything, they can just target specific areas that are bad, which means that they can directly prop up diversity in crops, but also they have to earmark less money in the budget for this, which means that they're much more likely to be efficient. Proud to pose.
Okay. Yeah, okay, I can start. Side government's case is essentially a sleight of hand. They equate consumer surplus with traders becoming richer. Their argument on big farms means that they ignore 85% of smallholders, and fiscal space means unpredictable bailouts, and jobs means abandoning the majority of India's workforce. We think that insofar as NSP isn't exactly perfect, but it disciplines both the government and traders in a way that PDP can never can. Let's make something clear. MSP is the seatbelt in food security. We think that PDP is the crash test in a free fall. Very proud to say with opposition. First, a few notes on this all-encompassing rebuttal on accountability here. Gov's story is essentially that markets are efficient and MSP blocks investment and PDP is doing things like unleashing private capital. We think that this story erases how accountability works in countries like India because I don't think that markets are neutral, but I think it's more likely that they're cartelized insofar as they are dominated by trader cartels and small farmers have no bargaining power and must sell immediately at harvest. We think that insofar as private buyers face no sanction for underpaying, there's no enforcement mechanism, and MSP at least gives farmers a credible exit option here. But also, I think that small farmers need guarantees instead of investors here, because insofar as you have these FDI partners with large agribusinesses, not 2-acre farmers with no collateral, this means that investors will answer the profit and not farmers in the first place, insofar as government procurement, by contrast, is politically accountable, and farmer unions and protest movements can punish governments for failing to buy. But also, I think that population growth means there's higher stakes for stability here. Because a billion mouths in a country like India and China means that volatility in staples is catastrophic. MSP guarantees procurement for PDS, and this means that when procurement fails, everyone sees warehouses empty and ration shops bare, and the failures become imminently visible, explosive, and politically costly. We think that insofar as PDP fails invisibly, delayed checks look like clerical errors instead of a massive amount of betrayal that affects millions, billions of people. But also, on this note about government volatility, I just want to turn the argument here. Because government tells you themselves that the government is bad and inefficient, our response is exactly, which is why you need visible enforcement structures. MSP is binary, we told you. Did the government buy your crop at MSP or not? Versus PDP is always going to be ultimately more opaque insofar as you have to ask questions like, the deficiency get calculated correctly? Did the record survive in the first place? Now that we can turn this argument, insofar as the less accountable the government is the more you want MSP's tangible, politically costly system. Okay, now just a few notes on this accountability incentive structure, telling you why we will always be ahead in terms of political corruption here. Because I think that MSP depots are far more likely to be open, physical, and monitored. Because farmers line up, grain gets weighed, and trucks move, and the process is observable and transparent. Note that this visibility means that small farmers can demand procurement alongside big farmers, and rich farmers can't quietly capture everything because these failures are public and unions can do things like mobilize. The impact of this is that MSP at least forces some degree of equal treatment. PDP payments are invisible, individualized, and far easier for elites to manipulate through paperwork and connections in the first place. But secondly, and I think this is what government doesn't address accurately, is that the timing advantage is very critical here because smallholders need cash immediately at harvest. They sell the same day they harvest because debts and input costs are due. MSP guarantees instant liquidation insofar as their crop means cash means survival. PDP forces them to sell at far depressed prices and wait months for reimbursements. I think that big farmers can wait, store, and use political ties to speed payments. I think that MSP is uniquely pro-smallholder versus PDP is structurally pro-elite. But in terms of collateral and credit dynamics, I think that rich farmers will always be protected here because they have access to formal credit. They can survive delays under PDP because banks will cover them, versus small farmers can rely on informal money lenders charging 20% interest, and without MSP, they can't repay loans on time, so they fall far deeper into debt spirals. But on the point of political accountability, I think that rich farmers already have political clout insofar as they can do things like lobby for debt waivers or special subsidies regardless of MSP. Small farmers only have leverage through visible procurement failures, and when MSP depots don't buy, entire villages will protest, and the failures are collective and explosive. This means that MSP is the only lever of accountability that smallholders have. PDP isolates them into these invisible, individualized grievances that cannot be ignored here. Okay, now on the point about quality. I think that the quality incentives are misframed here because farmers don't not care about quality because of MSP. The reality is that MSP crops are staples such as wheat and rice, and consumers don't pay premiums for fancier versions of staples, so tying price to quality is meaningless. Nobody buys this form of artisanal rationed wheat. You need bulk, cheap, edible grain in order to feed millions, and PDP actually worsens qualities here insofar as farmers are desperate for fast cash, so they are more likely to do things like cut corners on inputs, overuse chemicals, exhaust soil. No, lower quality outcomes long term. MSP stabilizes cash flow, which enables investment in sustainable practices in the first place. But also, I think there's an irrigation and subsidy trade-off here that is false, because insofar as India's budget doesn't work like a single bucket where MSP is likely to directly trade off with irrigation, in practice, MSP is more likely to enable other forms of investment, just stable farmer incomes, such as political pressure for continued agri-infrastructure. If farmers collapse under PDP debt spirals, the state spends far more on emergency loan waivers and bailouts, leaving far less room for planned irrigation spending. We think that MSP is predictable while PDP triggers crises. This means that we can effectively turn this argument. Insofar as the only MSP on our side of the house is able to create political stability for long-term investment, PDP generates volatility that eats budgets with firefighting over and over again as they are locked in these cyclical situations. Okay, on this consumer surplus argument, their claim was essentially that MSP hurts consumers by raising prices. PDP means that consumers are better off. Our response is that consumers already buy food at market price plus like some sort of trader margin. This means that they don't benefit from depressed farm gate prices. Middlemen capture the surplus, which directly feeds our link on how you are often locked into these cyclical forms of debt and how you sell to poor urban families under price gouged prices. We think that MSP feeds into this system where grain is sold to the poorest at subsidized rates. We think that's real consumer benefit insofar as the alternative is one in which poor urban families will lose their subsidized PDS food and their consumer surplus will shrink, and the only consumer who wins is actually the private trader who is capturing the most vulnerable in this instance and feeding off of desperation. Okay, they continuously assert here that most farms are big and therefore none of our impacts actually catch. I think that their claim is that MSP favors bigger farmers, small farms don't matter. Insofar as Ceci tells you that 85% of Indian farms are small and marginal holdings, then they are the median farmer here. Because big farmers can already store crops, lobby, and navigate bureaucracy in terms of political and social leverage. PDP tilts policy further down to them in this balancing act insofar as they can afford to do things like wait for higher prices, handle paperwork, and absorb delays. Note that on our side of the house, MSP is the only mechanism that guarantees a buyer for the marginal farmer, and without it, inequality only accelerates at ultimate rates, which only magnifies the social stratification. They tell you that the government has more money and frees up fiscal space for investment in jobs and industry, but I think the math doesn't hold here. Insofar as PDP is more likely to do things like shift the cost from grain storage to cash payout, and someone ultimately has to still pay the gap. At the very worst, delayed payments means that farmers default and turn to things like loans, and governments end up spending even more on loan waivers and emergency bailouts. We think that we are far more fiscally predictable here. Insofar as the argument is always going to boil down to government and corruption and efficiency, we think that MSP is too visible and politically costly to shrink insofar as PDP is opaque and every farmer is scattered.
All right. It's just gonna be ballots. Actually, it's gonna have like a little observation at the top. I want to draw your attention to a really key word in the info slide, which is that the minimum support price payment allows farmers to sell to the government, not that they have to sell to the government. What does this mean? It means that the government serves as a competitor for prices. So if you cannot sell on the local market, you are guaranteed a minimum price, which means that you can always recoup money. How does this affect the rest of this round? This means that, but on their side of the house, there is no minimum price, i.e., and they have conceded from MG that, or MO or LO, that traders can always collude to set the price lower and lower and lower, because now the big private traders have the monopoly on being able to sell crops to other big cities. Now, they say that, well, local markets still exist on our side of the house, and that's good because you can have this internal competition. We tell you that first, local markets are smaller, but the cities don't have that local market. They need traders to go to them. And it's because the majority of people live in India, live in cities. They themselves say there's been a massive increase in cities recently. That means that local markets aren't that useful for either consumers and farmers. You need the big traders to buy goods and agriculture from farmers in India and bring them over to the cities. Now, on our side of the house, notably, local markets still exist, which means that in the areas where agriculture is being grown, farmers still have the ability to sell on the local market to have that competition. Only the government comes in is when there is too much of a surplus for the local market, and farmers are just going to waste food sitting in their crops because the local market isn't enough of a demand. That's when they can sell to the government, and then the government takes on the onus of bringing it to the cities and being able to distribute it. What happens on their side of the house? We think that the private market and private actors are bad. Their accountability is always to profit and not individual actors. Their advocacy is that, oh, well, big traders come in with their FCI, but big traders collude to get lower prices from farmers because they're the ones taking the risk and shipping it and selling it. They say that FCI creates efficiency and leads to jobs, but I think that FCI is only efficient for investors, and I don't actually care about FCI in agriculture if it just helps the big guy. We think that the purpose of the government and the purpose of either policy is to actually help its citizens, which means that if you believe that the government government being able to set a minimum price and stopping traders from bringing the price all the way down. You should and helping not only farmers who are able to always recoup their initial costs, but also to help consumers who are guaranteed to be able to always buy from the government if they cannot afford the food from the private traders. You're always going to vote on side opposition. What does this mean? What are our two offensive ballots and why do they matter over theirs? The first is that we think that the government is able to bring over the food into the cities. Consumers are able to buy it for that subsidized cost if they are not able to afford it from big traders. Then on to our other argument about delayed payments. Now, we tell you that when the government is, when farmers have to sell it on the open market and then go through the entire bureaucratic process of getting the reimbursement back from the India, it is significantly more easy for receipts to get lost, for the paperwork not to be correct, for the government to just choose not to actually give it back to the farmers. This is really bad because the vast majority of farmers, 85% in India, are small farms, which means that like massive delays in their ability to get reimbursed hurts them because they cannot pay for the upfront things like food, for example, but also the new seeds that they have to buy year after year after year to grow the next crop. Which means that A, they just don't have food, or B, they take on interest, they take on like exploitative debts or exploitative loans with massive interest rates, which means that even if it is true that months later the government, gives them back their money, they are in fact, it doesn't matter because that money just goes back to paying back debt. Now, they say that, well, the government is bureaucratic, so they can probably sell food, like it also takes months to get it. But notably, on our side of the house, there is competition, i.e. if the government says, I'm going to take this food now, and I'm going to pay you back in a couple months, a farmer on our side of the house can be like, I don't really fuck with that. I'm just going to sell it on the open market. But or if the government says, here's a check for $5,000 for this food right now, then the farmer can choose to sell it to the government. So there's a much more degree of optionality on our side of the house that allows a race to the top in terms of prices for farmers and a race to the bottom on food prices for consumers. It is a win-win for everyone in India. On their side of the house, farmers have to sell to the traders, which means that if they are waiting around on the open market for months and months and months, that always is going to privilege the large farmers who have giant warehouses and don't have to immediately recoup process. So they can wait around forever on the open market, but on our side of but that disadvantages the smaller farmers who cannot do it and have to just immediately sell for the much lower price. Very proud to oppose.
Everyone see and hear me? Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Everyone ready? 3, 2, 1. Now, the top-level observation in the LOR doesn't matter because they never prove to you that people are going to exercise the option to sell in the private market versus the government subsidy, versus the MSP. The reason that we gave you for why they sell in the MSP and why everyone just gets priced out of the private market is really, really simple and just conceded from PMC. Which is that if the government buys unlimited goods from you, then you have no reason to sell to the target market because you don't have to care about consumer demand. Instead, you just make one crop, overproduce it, and sell to the government for all the rice surplus arguments that are just dropped out of Shruti speech. The reason this is really important is because at the point at which the big farms start doing this, it means they outcompete the small farms, and small farms have no choice but to just hop on the gravy train and hope they don't fall off. Because it doesn't matter if people have the option to sell to to sell to private markets because they're never used. Because the big companies are the ones that decide the markets and are the monopoly and are like the price setters, and the supply setters are the ones that are going to be selling to the government. They're going to be doing it for a dirt cheap price for and selling an infinite amount for all the conceded arguments at a PMC. So that observation does not matter at all. The first thing I want to deal with is why are farmers not the most important stakeholder? I just think that they're going with this unwarranted, honest, asserted fact claim that 85% are small farmers, but they haven't dealt with our several layers of analysis as to the 5 drop warrants from Prithi's speech as to why the market is actually monopolized. So Ceci, I don't care if you read in Ryan Lafferty's matter file that 85% are small farms because you need to warrant and prove that is true in order for you to win this round. But given that we use your own warrant, the farming has high upfront costs and the input costs are fixed, it means that small farms can't just prop up out of nowhere. And if they do, they die immediately immediately. So I don't care if 85% are small farms, if they're going to go away in 1 week, regardless of what system that we're using, because it means the vast majority of the system is the large monopolized farms because they haven't dealt with the tons of warrants as to why this isn't the case. The most important link that I have to extend here, the only link that I have to extend here, because it's the only clean one, is that the big farm, if it is the case that farming is extremely unstable, something that you have to have large amounts of fixed and variable costs in, then the big farms are the only ones that are getting bailouts, which means the system is monopolized. So which the reason this argument is important is because it takes all their arguments on delays of payments. Because if the system is monopolized and they're getting bailouts anyways because they're all tied up with the Punjabi prime minister, then it doesn't matter whether or not they get delays of payments, which is realistically their only offense when it comes to the producers themselves. Which means that we're just clearly winning because they already are getting this and they already are well off. They're just not the most important stakeholder. But even if you for some reason do believe that you have to vote on the farmers themselves, we're just going to win this clash anyways, because the MSP is a low price, straight conceded out of PMC, because the government has to spend so much money on distribution centers, selling distribution centers. They just say, but they already have all the infrastructure when it comes to the existing farms. But if their argument is true that the small farms are dying and cropping up every day, then the established connections obviously don't exist, because in 2 weeks now they have the Punjab Farm A that died 3 weeks ago, and then now they have to go to Punjab Farm B. So the established connections obviously don't exist, which takes out their own argument, but also they lose the other flip side of it, which is the distribution is really expensive and the distribution is constantly changing. So it doesn't matter if they have established connections with the farmers, they don't have established connections when it comes to selling the products. Really have to put so much more money. We have to deal with every single step of the process, which really don't have as much money to offer when it comes to the MSP. The only response we get from this is just like the hand wavy thing from the MO, which is that like, the budget is not earmarked and it's not like a trade-off or zero sum. But obviously it is. I just have no idea why you're going to buy this argument when the comparative is quite clear, which is that what we told you in PMC, India has a set amount of money for the Department of Agriculture, and it doesn't need to spend more for all the corruption arguments. It doesn't just mean the budget is going to balloon or they take it away from other parts. If the budget is $100, I would rather them spend 10 of it on selling and distribution and 90 on food stamps compared to 80 on food and distribution, because the food and distribution is so unbelievably unstable. Their only remaining link to this then is government efficiency leading to delayed payments. But I want to note, they're not offense. They have no offense on whether they get more money, only whether they get money faster. But because I proved that you get more money from PDP, because the government has more money to put on that because they're not spending as much money on other parts of the process, as long as I prove to you that the speed is either negligible or turned or like non-unique, we're just clearly winning, because it is obviously better for small farms to get more money for all their arguments about upfront costs. Why are we winning efficiency, or why is efficiency a wash? First, the government waits to buy because they are inefficient. They're not buying immediately per Shruti's conceded arguments, because if all their corruption arguments are true, that it's really hard and really easy to mess up this process, then the government corruption arguments are also, we don't sell this buy from small farms immediately. But also, if they have backdoor deals with all the big farms in Punjab, they're not going to try and buy and do favorable terms when it comes to these small farms in Haryana, turning all the MO analysis about elitism. But also, if they are correct that small farms keep propping up across India, means they don't have established connections, and that warrant doesn't work for them either, and actually turns against them. Government efficiency is either non-unique as such, and that the only way small farms are actually better off is when they get more money for the MSP and for all the investment arguments that are just told or pat the pen on everything else, but obviously aren't. Check your flow. Shrimpy gives you tons of independent FDI arguments, and the agri-tech arguments are to prove that investment is going to happen like just is independent. Finally, why do we win consumers? What do the population centers actually look like? I have no idea why they're talking about the government needing to sell in Mumbai and Bangalore. I don't have no idea. The vast majority of people don't live here. The vast majority of people live in the centers that are not being served right now because they're developing. And right now, there's no, per all the government arguments, no ability to subsidize their food because they're spending all the money on MSP, and no incentive to do so because these don't have exist yet. So you need private market fill-in to make this happen. The government has more money to help consumers, more money to make crops more efficient. So that's why we're going to get more money in the hands of these people. Proud to propose.